Welcome to Never Again is Now, a podcast about antisemitism. The popular CBS fictional TV series The Equalizer recently featured an episode dealing with current anti-Semitic incidents. Today we are discussing that with the leading actor of the episode. I'm Evelyn Marcus, and in addition to being a psychologist, I'm featured in the documentary about anti-Semitism Never Again is Now. I am a Dutch Jew and the daughter of Holocaust survivors. In 2006, I immigrated to the United States because of the rising anti-Semitism in Europe.
I am Phyllis Zimpler Miller. I grew up in Elgin, Illinois. The Jewish community there, very few in number, were not connected to the Holocaust. Our parents and grandparents had come at the turn of the 20th century to escape the Tsar and other pogroms. And yet, in September 1970, only 25 years after the end of World War II, my U.S. Army officer husband and I were stationed in Munich, Germany, and this changed our lives as Jews forever.
Today, we have the honor to have Adam Goldberg in our show as our guest. Adam is the leading actor on The Equalizer, an actor by trade, but also a filmmaker, musician, and photographer. Adam Goldberg's career has spanned more than 3 decades, comprising a vast resume of eclectic work, both on and off the screen. Goldberg can currently be seen starring as computer hacker Harry Kashagian on the hit CBS series The Equalizer, which is reimagining of the classic films. The show had a massive debut to over 23 million viewers in 2021 and is currently airing its the third season. So Adam, welcome to our show, and we're thrilled to have you on.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
I'm very excited for this episode because, TV fictional shows, especially very popular ones, frequently deal with current events. But it's very rare to see a TV show as successful as The Equalizer in its 3rd season now, right? Deal with current anti-Semitic incidents. In fact, I rewatched the episode again last night, including giving statistics of the rise in anti-Semitism. How did this come about? It's really exciting and unusual.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what took so long, to be honest with you. I mean, I don't watch a lot of I guess what's known as procedural television, so or torn from the headlines, I guess, television. So I wasn't necessarily aware of how little or much the topic was explored. My sense is that very little. Just as in general, I find that the stories often don't even make the news, or certainly aren't the leading stories unless it's a major massacre. And then often it seems to be as much about, gun control, which is obviously an issue, as it is about anything else. But I know this episode was really important. Adam Glass, who was a newer writer and newer showrunner, co-showrunner with Joe Wilson on our show. And, he's Jewish, and he definitely wanted to tell this story. So I'm sure it has, a lot to do with that.
Hey, but just to say, the episode was even called Never Again. So it was clearly targeted towards discussing this issue. So yeah. Evelyn has a question for you.
Yeah, well, Adam, what was the reaction of the cast and crew as the episode was being filmed?
Well, I just feel like maybe I should set it up a little bit for those people who haven't, seen the episode. But it is about a series of increasingly violent anti-Semitic attacks, that ultimately culminates with a potential attack by several gunmen at a synagogue. But there's the beating of a rabbi in it. I mean, it's a pretty brutal episode, even by the standards of The Equalizer, which explores a lot of these topics. I can't say exactly what when you're doing a show like this, people are really pretty, so focused on the stress of making a television show, and so many of the topics that I think the show deals with are pretty intense. So I can really only speak for myself, which is to say, you know, in addition to having a much larger role in this episode than I do in some of the other episodes, that, you know, it definitely had a big personal impact on me. And it's a theme which I have explored, you know, as an actor, dating back to playing the Jewish soldier in Saving Private Ryan, through playing, you know, taking, you know, a comedic approach to it, and playing the Hebrew Hammer, to, you know, being very outspoken on, you know, in my social media about the rise of anti-Semitism and my particular experience with anti-Semitism. And so, you know, I definitely felt, you know, a certain weight, I guess, on my shoulders. And I found myself being kind of more moved maybe than I thought I would be while I was shooting it. I think partly because it is an issue which I've explored on screen in really the most, you know, vivid terms. I mean, I was stabbed by a Nazi, you know, and what has now become, you know, a pretty famous death scene in Saving Private Ryan. It doesn't get much more visceral than that, but, you know, that was many years ago. And in many ways that felt kind of, you know, it felt historical. I mean, it didn't seem like something that would happen,
Right.
you know, or possibly could happen if you left your house.
Right.
Now, just, what was it, 2 days ago, essentially, you know, you know, it happened in Texas to a degree. I mean, it wasn't blatantly anti-Semitic, but it was certainly a guy who espoused white supremacist, you know, and blatantly Nazi, you know, philosophy, you know, referring to the attack on the mall in Texas. And so, you know, it felt, you know, eerily, you know, profound, I guess. You know.
Yes. It's I can totally identify with what you say, because I grew up in Europe, in Holland, in Amsterdam, the most
Yeah.
liberal city of the world, maybe.
Yeah.
And without any significant anti-Semitism, maybe a remark here or there, but that was it.
Right.
And then suddenly we would be attacked in the streets of Amsterdam, you know. So it's bizarre.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's yeah, I mean, it's come, I mean, I don't, you know, I know, I wonder how much of it is, you know, a rise of inner, you know, sort of, you know, internal hate and misunderstanding, and, you know, the spread of these, you know, age-old conspiracy theories, and how much is just emboldening, you know, you know, feelings that were lying fairly dormant until a few years ago, when, you know, I think several mainstream politicians sort of, you know, emboldened these ideas. It's hard to know. I think it's probably a combination of both of those things. But
So let's go back to talking about your character, who up until this point had been portrayed as Armenian. So tell us how that backstory changed. But though I will just say, I love the sentence in the episode when you said you have genocide on both sides of your family. That was a great line.
yeah, well, that's something I actually had proposed to them, because I thought, well, that we should address the fact that I'm playing a guy who's both Armenian, you know, and Jewish, and you know, and not just fully kind of disavow the Armenian part of it, and much in the same way, I guess we've never dealt with the Jewish half. I mean, you know, a lot of this is just a function of being on a TV show. I mean, I kind of always make this joke, which is when you do TV, you know, when you do a movie, you read the script, you know who the guy is, and you prepare accordingly. On a television show, you can find out in season 2, you know, that your mother is your father, and that they're both geese, you know, or something. And so in this case, I think, you know, they didn't write this role for me, Harry Koshigian. That was a role that was written. It was offered to me, and had they said 3 years ago, you know, you're going to be playing this Jewish character, he's a hacker, blah, 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 I probably would have said, hey, you know what, let's not make him Jewish, or there's really no reason for me to play a Jewish character unless that really sort of factors into the storylines. And I, you know, and not much was made of it. And in fact, I sort of thought, well, at some point we'd probably do a story about his Armenian, you know, background, because every character at some point has sort of dealt with their, you know, cultural background. And but I think, again, that this was a story they wanted to tell. I was clearly the vessel to tell that story. And so, I became a half Jewish, half Armenian. In reality, I'm actually half Jewish and half, non-Jewish, a lot of other things, but not Armenian.
Adam, in your personal life, not any of the Jewish or non-Jewish characters you have played, but do you identify personally as Jewish?
Yeah, I mean that's a question I guess you could say that I've struggled with really much of my life. I essentially grew up Jewish. I didn't really think twice about it. I mean, I used to make jokes, I guess, about being half Jewish and half Catholic, but in fact, my mother, who was, grew up Catholic and of, German, Irish, French, Italian, Mexican descent, became a pretty vehemently disavowed Catholic by the time she was, college aged. And I think it was even her idea to send me to Jewish day school. I mean, obviously both my father and mother agreed on this, but so I went to Jewish day school from about first grade through sixth grade. And so, for all intents and purposes, while we weren't religious, I guess you would say, we certainly, certainly at school, while very secular, went to had Shabbat services on Friday, and learned Hebrew, and we had Seders, and we had Hanukkah. We also had Christmas, but after I graduated, I went to a more a non-denominational school, a school called Oakwood, which was kind of sort of a progressive prep school, I guess. And I guess I felt like I didn't get bar mitzvah. That was another contribution, I guess, to this episode, which was that I wanted to sort of make that distinction. That this was a kid in the episode, and also a kid, based on my own experience, where I had sort of said, it would be disingenuous of me to have a bar mitzvah. Not sort of really understanding in my 13-year-old brain that there's more to it than, the words that you're saying, not to take them so fundamentally and fundamentalistly, I guess I should say. But somehow I felt it would be disingenuous to do it, really, and to do it in a temple and really kind of, power through it, the ceremony, and make a bunch of money. That's kind of like get a bunch of checks and some pens and things like that, right? Because that's what, you kind of get when you get a bar mitzvah, a lot of checks and pens, right? So, and then when I became an actor professionally, that's something I also had to grapple with. How much do I want to lean into being a Jew? How much do I want to be able to portray any cultural, anything within reason, right? Certainly some of my heroes, whether it's, I don't know, Robert De Niro played his fair share of Jewish characters. And I would always complain that you don't see a lot of Jewish actors. I mean, well, I should correct that. In the olden days, you saw a lot of Jewish actors playing all kinds of different cultural backgrounds, but you didn't know they were Jewish. I mean, you didn't know Kirk Douglas was Jewish, right? And so, but people who are openly Jewish, right, who kept their Jewish last names and that kind of thing, seem to be more typecast. And so that's something I always had to struggle with. And I think in struggling with that, it maybe pushed me a little bit further away from my cultural background. And I certainly felt culturally Jewish. I was a big fan of Woody Allen movies and deli and jazz, and a lot of things that are really a huge part of Jewish culture. And I was always very clear to make the distinction between being Jewish culturally, being Jewish religiously, and then like being Israeli, because that's something that people conflate quite a bit. And so I think in an effort to sort of create these kind of compartments, it can be a little bit confusing in the end, sort of who and what it means to be Jewish, certainly a secular Jewish American. I guess as I get older, I feel like it's definitely my responsibility to own the part of me that feels connected to that, to my Jewishness, to Judaism, to Jewishness, and to instill that in my children, to make them aware of what Jewish people have been through the centuries, and make everyone else as aware as I possibly can be, with the small amount of bandwidth that I can reach, as an actor. So that's my, I guess, convoluted answer to that question.
Go ahead, Evelyn.
And Adam, there are, of course, a bunch of positive reasons to identify as a Jew, and to include Jewish culture and religion in your life, if you want. There could also be, and you mentioned a little subtle one, there could also be negative reasons not to do it.
Sure. Yeah.
You mentioned that in Hollywood in the past, actors with a Jewish family name would be typecasted. And if you don't want to be typecasted all the time, then you better not have a Jewish family name or identify as very Jewish. Do you personally experience today in your work, and also if you make choices for your children, that there are negative reasons, to stay away a little bit from Jewish identity?
Yeah, I mean, putting all the professional stuff, because obviously I'm in a very specific situation, right? So putting all of that aside, I always had a strange feeling. Now, I didn't grow up in an environment where, again, I felt like anti-Semitism was either prevalent or even still very contemporary, right? But many of the people, it seemed like most of the people I knew were Jewish, in fact. But I think what being an actor did is it sort of exposed me in a way. And I'll give you an example. My first film where I had any real exposure was my couple years, really a year and a half into my professional career, was a movie called Dazed and Confused. And I play a sort of a cranky, acerbic intellectual kid, right? And I get beat up by a kind of a sort of, well, I call him a Nazi in the movie, but by a greaser, like a kind of a 50 greasers guy, and it takes place in the 70s. And so I get beat up in the movie, and the character's name is Mike Newhouse, not so far as I know, a Jewish name, and I remember they would do these test screenings, right, for movies, and they would ask a question on these cards, and one of the questions is what's your favorite part of the movie, or something like that. And somebody wrote in, I know because Richard Linklater, the director, would often tell the story. Someone wrote in, when the Jew gets his ass kicked. Now, that could mean a lot of things, right? For a lot of people, that's their favorite part of the movie because it's a fun part of the movie. I hit the guy, he hits me. It's kind of one of the most action-oriented scenes in the entire movie, which is otherwise deals with a lot of like teen ennui. And so was he just identifying me as a Jew because it was an easy way to identify me visually? Was he identifying me as a Jew because I'm smart and funny and intellectual? Was he stereotyping me? Was he saying that his favorite part was when he saw the Jewish character, though, again, the character was never Jewish, as far as I knew, get beat up because it was satisfying to him? And many years later on, really in the last few years, I'll tell you exactly when during the run-up to the 2016 election, during the Republican primaries, I was very vocal on Twitter, and particularly anti-Trump, who at the time seemed less like a menace and more like, a joke, I guess. And so I would criticize him vocally, and I would get in my inbox or in my mentions on Twitter And I can show you on my phone. I have hundreds of screenshots in a folder called Nazis, and because I was literally getting sent Holocaust era, propaganda, and imagery. And so it would be like, what does one thing really have to do with the other? Exactly. I'm criticizing this guy for being, let's say, anti-immigrant, and then it's like back to the ovens with you or something like that. And I was like, wow, some of these people didn't know like who I was. They saw blue check mark, by my name, I guess, and they saw Goldberg. And so there you go, the onslaught of and that was really where it kind of came into sort of stark relief for me. But there was always an uneasiness in this country, and again, in my 20s, I would make jokes about driving through the South, just having a kind of an uneasiness, certainly not the way that, an African-American person probably would, based on the history of their treatment, in, let's say, the South or in Middle America or whatever you want to call it. But I always had this kind of uneasiness. But now I can give you an example. I ride motorcycles. I was talking to this guy at the Harley dealership here, and I'm in New York, but in New Jersey, and he used to work just a few years ago in Alabama, and he had to leave. He's a Jewish guy. His name is Adam, actually, and he years ago took a picture of himself in front of the Hebrew Hammer poster or something, which was funny. I ended up buying a motorcycle from the guy, but anyway. And he told me just a horrific story about a guy who came in, wouldn't buy the motorcycle from the black dealer, and sales rep, and so bought it from him, not knowing this guy was Jewish, but saying all kinds of fucking, pardon my French, all kinds of, horrible stuff. And it's just like, and the guy eventually just, had to leave and, moved to New Jersey. And it's like, I was like, when was this? And he said, 5 years ago, right? So, yeah, these are all ways in which I think being, openly identified as a Jewish person is, can be both, disheartening at its best, right? And then I guess really dangerous at its worst,
And were you recommended to change your name when you started in acting?
No. I mean, it was the early 90s. I mean, it wasn't like that. I mean, there was I used to get confused, still do, and vice versa, confused for Jonathan Silverman a lot. I mean, I actually, there was a guy who, on the one hand, he would do a Neil Simon movie. On the other hand, he would do, Weekend at Bernie's or whatever. I mean, he wasn't necessarily like the Jewish actor. He's clearly a Jewish guy, Jewish last name, whatever. I was going to change it because I didn't want there to be, I wanted to have basically as many opportunities as I could. And I was about to change it, in fact, when somebody talked me out of it. It's a long story, but it's unrelated to what we're talking about. And then they had already struck the credits for they filmed the credits for Dazed and Confused. But I was about to do it, so it's interesting. It's always interesting to imagine if at all that would have made some sort of difference in the trajectory of my career. And I kind of tend to doubt it would, actually, but it's a kind of an unavoidable question about that road not taken, that I've asked myself.
Did you have a name picked out?
Yeah, it was Stark. I was a big fan of all the James Dean movies, and he plays this character Jim Stark. So in fact, the reason I was talked out of it is because there was an actor at the time named Adam Stork, and a friend of mine said to me that there would be some confusion, and so I said, okay. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure on some level I was looking for a way to kind of get out of it. I mean, that would have been a pretty big event. I had already been acting, but I wasn't really known as an actor necessarily. So Dazed and Confused seemed like it was going to be the thing where if you were going to do it, you had to do it, before that. And, I just didn't make my mind up fast enough. And so that was that.
Are you glad that you didn't change your name?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, it's kind of like, sort of like, there's no way to know what would have been any different, if anything. And, I guess, yeah, for the simple reason that it you know, that it's my family name. I mean, it only goes back so many generations before it becomes something else, but you know, but it's my family name, you know, and it always felt a little bit weird like that. My dad, you know, would have a kid whose name, you know, he didn't share, and so, you know, I mean, I was ambivalent. Let's be clear about doing it. It wasn't like I'm going to do this, and I just didn't get it in on time, you know.
Let's return to the show. Do you think that the episode Never Again will encourage other TV series to tackle the issue of anti-Semitism, since it is really dramatically rising in the United States?
Yeah, I don't know if the episode itself will, but I would be hard pressed to imagine that it wasn't explored in other, you know, formats. I have noticed a sort of an uptick in Jewish themed shows, not always played by Jewish actors, which is a whole separate discussion we can have.
Yes.
Sarah Silverman calls it Jew face, which is a, you know, a sort of you know, an offhanded way of you know, broaching the subject, but I would have to imagine that that it would, because it's become such a you know, a sort of central theme of the last several years. I mean, it's, again, though, I mean, I think we should be clear. One of the things that's really difficult about discussing anti-Semitism is that people don't want to hear about it for different reasons than they don't want to hear about other forms of prejudice. And, you know, part of that is baked into the very premise of anti-Semitism, you know, which is that, what are you complaining about? You know, I mean, you can get this from all sides, you know, really hardcore anti-Semites, right? You know, neo-Nazis or whatever. They'll tell you you're not white. Other people will tell you you're white, so what are you complaining about? And so you kind of can't win there. And then, you know, you'll be told, well, shut up, you control the media. My most recent, you know, joke is, if we controlled the media, why did the episode that we're discussing here today air opposite the Oscars? I mean, they could have aired it whenever they wanted to. it was somehow we still managed to do okay that night, but I kind of think it was buried. And you know, I was doing quite a lot of press for it. So in fact, I haven't had a publicist in several years, but I got one, excuse me, a few months ago before the episode, again, for the first time in many years. And so yeah, because, you know, part of this conspiracy is that there's this, you know, there's 12 of us, right, who are controlling the banks and the media and whatever. So, you know, stop whining. I mean, so part of the anti-Semitism is that the anti-Semitism doesn't exist. You know,
yes,
it's an incredibly brilliant form of gaslighting. I mean, you can't win. Of course, we will win, but it's hard when that's the argument, that you're lying. You know, the people won't believe their lying eyes, right?
Right. So if our listeners would want to encourage their favorite TV show to depict forms of anti-Semitism existing in the United States or elsewhere in the world, do you have any suggestions of how to do this? How they could encourage their favorite TV show to pay attention to this phenomenon in society?
I mean, listen, I feel like if I knew how to do that, I would probably be doing something else for a living. But you know, I guess I mean, you know, all I know is, I think what we all know now is that you know, we all have a much bigger soapbox than we used to with social media and that sort of thing. I mean, in the olden days, you know, if your favorite show was being, let's say, canceled, you would literally write letters or something, you know, and now I think, you know, there are all kinds of different ways of you know, of kind of interacting with the people in power. But you know, I think there's a more fundamental issue here, you know, which is that, you know, a lot of Jewish people who work in the industry, I mean, this has been my theory. I don't know. In many ways don't want to deal with it, right? There's a shame involved. And that's, you know, I used to get told all the time in not very long ago, if I was up for a certain role, let's say, and I auditioned for it, they would say, oh man, that was you know, that was an incredible audition. You did a great job, but we're going to go kind of more all-American. Now, this was something that was okay to say until really recently. What the hell does that mean? And the funny thing is, I never questioned it, right? I was like, right. I mean, I was upset but I don't even know that I was insulted. I was like, all American. I knew what they meant. They meant Chad, the blonde guy. We're going to go more guy next door. Like, whoa, what? But I live next door to guys that look nothing like that guy. So anyway, I could go on and on about that, but I guess I think that what has to be undone is the shame of outing ourselves, of expressing and connecting to our Jewishness. And I think that starts kind of at the top.
Yes, I think absolutely. And we're coming to the end of the interview, and you've been so articulate about the topics that we want to discuss, but is there anything that we've missed that you'd like to add?
No, I mean, I really appreciate that you guys are doing this and that you kind of gave me, you know, me a forum to, you know, to discuss this. And, you know, I will say one thing. There's a book I read recently, and it really encapsulated exactly what I wanted to say for years. But, you know, frankly, I just like wasn't, I wasn't concise enough, or, you know, I'm not a writer of books, but there's a comedian and writer named David Baddiel, an English comedian, writer, performer. And he wrote a book called Jews Don't Count. And it's very small. I have very little patience. I'm a little ADD, so I have a hard time reading, actually. And this book is very small and fantastic, and really encapsulates the contemporary iteration of anti-Semitism and precisely what we've sort of touched on, which is this idea that it's the prejudice that just doesn't count. I used to, years ago, I would always call it America's cuddly racism, which was a kind of a really clumsy way of trying to say what I was trying to say. Anyway, he says it much more clearly than I can, and I encourage everyone to read that book.
Excellent recommendation.
Yeah,
We thank you so much for coming on our show. We thank our listeners. Those of you who have not yet seen Evelyn's documentary, Never Again Is Now, you may see it on Amazon or YouTube. Also, you can learn more about my nonfiction Holocaust play, thinedgeofthewedge.com, which has firsthand testimonies of survivors and saviors, and especially targeted for young people to learn more about the Holocaust, but also to learn to speak up today against all hate, which is how we end every episode. We say to our listeners, please, without putting yourself in physical harm, speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate.
Yes.